Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for waiting. Now let's begin. Thank you very much for attending the lecture series towards critical, historical, and transnational dialogues on Japanese model of education, organized by the Global Education Office of Kyoto University School of Education. My name is Sachio Ando, full-time lecturer of the Global Education Office. Now, about today's program. First, I am going to give a brief overview of the lecture series and introduce to you the lecturer today. And after the lecture, we are going to field your questions and address comments. It's going to be about 2-hour program. In this academic year, our office is holding lecture series comprising 9 online seminars entitled Towards Critical, Historical, and Transnational Dialogues on Japanese Model of Education. This lecture series attempts to connect diverse examples of how Japanese education developed overseas in the past 100 years with transnational perspective as a common thread. When transplanted in culturally and historically different contexts, characteristics of Japanese education became condensed and apparent in the educational practice. We would like to look at how such Japanese model of education changed or continued over the years. The first lecture was delivered by Dr. Mira Shimabukuro, lecturer of University of Washington at Boston, entitled Me Inwardly Before I Dared, Private Writing, the Legacy of Japanese American Internment, and the Rhetorics of Gammon. By analyzing the diaries kept by Japanese Americans in internment camps during the war, the notion of gammon and the art of writing in diaries were revealed as what is very Japanese. And the second lecture was intended break and unexpected continuation, school documents in and after Japan's colonial rule, given by Professor Sato Kohiura, Associate Professor of National Museum of Japanese History. School documents called Kakkoshi were kept by the schools in Taiwan and Korea under the Japanese colonial rule and were continued for some time even after liberation in 1945. We learned that they were not merely the records. The act of writing helped these schools establish their collective identity. The third lecture was given by Professor Takeshi Komagome of the Graduate School of Education of Kyoto University under the theme of Seikatsu Tsurikata, Daily Life Writing, Flying to the World, the problem of translation embedded in the children of the world, unquote. Daily life writing is a Japanese educational practice. Again, the act of writing helps children connect with the world and understand themselves. Today, the fourth lecture is going to be given by Dr. Sachio Negawa, a project research fellow at International Research Center for Japanese Studies. Dr. Negawa was born in Osaka in 1963 and became fascinated with samba when to Brazil. He graduated from the Graduate School of Philosophy, Languages, and Human Sciences. The Graduate School for Advanced Studies is where he received a PhD. After serving as an associate professor of University of Brasilia, he took the current post of project research fellow at International Research Center for Japanese Studies. He is also a lecturer at Doshichi University and Shiga University. His research areas cover migration history and comparative cultural studies. He has authored many books, including The Town Japanese Immigrants Built on the Other Side of the World, which was published by Tokyo University Press this last summer. He has also authored The History of Education of Japanese Immigrants in Brazil, published in 2016 by Mitsuji Shobo, and The History of Education of Japanese Immigrants, Transcending Borders and Interconnecting Perspective of Multicultural Experience, published by Minerva Shobo in 2016, co-authored with Shoichi Inoue, among others. He has also contributed the article series, The Japanese Education Crossing the Ocean and Japantown in Brazil, and Discover Nikkei, the website operated by Japanese American National Museum. Today, he is going to give us a lecture entitled Development of Japanese Educational Culture in Brazil as a note for interconnected history. Nikkei society in Brazil in the period before the Pacific War had dual characteristics of being an exclave of Japanese empire and an immigrant community forming a part of the nation-state Brazil. Reflecting this duality in the education of Nikkei children, Japanese education and Brazilian public education ran parallel. He is going to review the elementary school education for Nikkei children, which reached its peak in the late 1930s, and discuss how the Japanese-style education developed in the context of modernization from the perspective of interconnected histories of Japan and Brazil.
Now, Professor Ando introduced me. My name is Sachio Negawa. Thank you very much for introduction. Very happy to meet you all. Today, I would like to talk about the expansion of the Japanese educational culture in modern Brazil from the viewpoint of the connected history. Professor Ando introduced me very briefly, and the history of myself and a little presentation of herself. As my first thing, I would like to tell you, this is the cover of the books that she has introduced previously. In 1990s, in the middle of 1990s, when I was in my 20s, I was young, and Latin music has been very much introduced in Japan. I loved the samba of Brazil. I listened to the music very often. Therefore, I really wanted to go to São Paulo Carnival and actually see a samba myself before I die. And I went to Brazil for the first time, and I enjoy the carnival in the São Paulo city. It's like the toy box scattered around in the city, and very chaotic, and the event attracted me so well. I was very much charmed by Brazil, and I came back in 1996. At that time, I was teaching at high school in Osaka, and I decided to move to Brazil. In those days, there is the Humanity Study Institute in São Paulo, and they gave us an invitation letter and given the researcher's visa, and visited Brazil. For the first year, I went to the team of the samba, and also Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. I traveled around, and 1 year passed so quickly. And during that time, if you want to live longer in Brazil, it's better to get a student visa. My friend gave advice, and studied the Brazil language, and also wrote some thesis, and finally I was able to join the university in Brazil, in São Paulo. In the beginning, I didn't know what to do, what kind of a study I should do. For instance, the Japanese religious sect in São Paulo, or the study of the urban cities in São Paulo, and I studied various things in the beginning of my student days. But I lived in the Bairro Oriental, that is Oriental Quarter, in the downtown of São Paulo, and that was the largest Japanese people's community. And also the Koreans and the Chinese also joined this Bairro Oriental. And therefore, at this moment, this is one of the largest ASEAN ethnic town with the Japanese gardens. And this is a representative tourist area of São Paulo. Now, São Paulo Bairro Oriental can go back to a long history. When I was studying at the São Paulo University, and I was able to write the master's degrees, the thesis taking 3 years to finish, and then continue intermittently the study of the San Paulo, and finally it came as the San Paulo, the Bairo Oriental. The book was published in July this year. And after writing the master's degree thesis, I was wondering whether I should go back to Japan or continue to live in Sao Paulo. But there's Brasilia, there's Brasilia University of the Federation, and for the translation department, there was the public offering of the job, and I entered, and successfully, luckily enough, I was hired in 2001 at the Federation University of Brasilia, the capital city. And then particularly the education of Japanese immigrants from before and during the war period, I shifted to the study of the education of the Japanese immigrants. In 2016, I wrote a book, The History of the Education of the Japanese Immigrants in Brazil. This is the refined version of my doctor's thesis. And based upon these studies and researches, today I would like to talk about the quadruple structure of the imperial structure, and also the Japanese education culture in Brazil from the viewpoint of the connected history. So the Japanese education culture and the quadruple the structures, I would like to explain these terms first. And then in 1930s, there was a peak of the flourishing education of the Japanese children in Brazil. Particularly, there was a double structure of the Japanese education and the Brazilian public education. Third, I'd like to talk about the interconnectedness of the modernization of Japan and Brazil. And thirdly, I'd like to talk about the futures of the Japanese educational culture in Brazil. In 1930s, there are some features, for instance, the sports activities amongst the Japanese the children, home front activities, and also the school excursion. Probably I would go into the chaotic presentation, but before I close, I would be talking about the problems and the potential and the possibilities of the study of the history of the education of the Japanese immigrant children in Brazil. I use the term Japanese educational culture in this lecture series. The term Japanese educational culture has been used. But regardless of this, in promoting the Brazilian studies, I came up with this concept. In other words, this is about the characteristic features of Japanese education system and the culture, particularly before the war, the Pacific War. There was the educational method and contents of the school education, extracurricular activities, and also the worshipping of the imperial the portraits at 4 major festivals, and also the reading of the emperor's prescript of the education, and also the national the flag and athletic meet, and also the singing of the national anthem and various activities at school. And particularly in 2016, this is written together with Inoue Shoichi, and this is the book published in the history of the Japanese the immigrants transcending the national borders and interconnectedness. When I did visiting studies, I decided to publish this book as a result of the educations. And therefore, I use the term, the view of the history, which is interconnectedness. All of the macrotic features are interconnected, and also microscopic experiences of the immigrants are interconnected. From the viewpoint of the chains, we would look at the microscopic various the experience from the viewpoint of the macroscopic the events of the world history. And I would like to call this the view of the history from the interconnectedness, the concepts to understand the dynamics of the history. Now, this is a quadruple structures in the history of the migration and the migration of the Japanese people. We were talking about the three layers of the structures. Kimura Kenji and Ali Shinzo talked about the emperor, or the imperial structure, which is the three layers, Japan, and also the external, the colonies, Taiwan and Korea. And after the Japan also in the war, the Kanto and the South Pacific islands and the Manchuria were considered as part of the influence sphere of Japan. But in addition to that, Hawaii, America, and Brazil, which exist outside of the non-influential sphere, but this can be considered as an enclave and added to this structure, and I propose the quadruple structure. Today I'd like to talk about the history of the education of the immigrants, the children in Brazil. Even though we focus upon the teachers as well as those who have a power, rather difficult to see, for instance, from the end of 19th century, and there are many immigrants. In other words, students went to the United States, and immigrants in the beginning, but students in the beginning, but they became immigrants. And the new Immigration Act was promulgated with a very strong anti-Japanese character. And with this enactment, the United States was difficult to live. Therefore, and they decided to break away from the North America, the United States, and immigrated to the Brazil. The agricultural farmers and the teachers and the other people as well. In the middle of the 1930s in Brazil, there was some movement, anti-Japanese, and which became stronger. So, rebelling against the anti-Japanese nature, the intelligentsia as well as the teachers came back to Japan, or they went further to Manchuria to find a place to be active. And also the immigrants of the farmers in the middle of 1930s and onward, there were some anti-Japanese movements. And in this context, people started to propose that with a slogan that Asians should come back to Asia. So this is a re-immigration activities to coming back to Asiatic countries. So these are the macroscopic the event in the world history, but they affect the life strategy of the each individual immigrants in a microscopic way. So I would like to talk about this and view this structure as a quadruple structure, and from even more global perspective. For instance, the migration of the Japanese people in the modern history, it can be seen in this chronological order. This is the history of the education of the transcended national borders. I talked about this book earlier. And 8 areas can be focused. For instance, in 1968, with a Meiji Restoration, this start in the lunar calendar of April. Sachio Negawa with the ship departed, having 140 Japanese, which went to Hawaii. That was the first year of Meiji, and therefore this is the Meiji first immigrants. This is overlapping the participation of Japan into the participation into the world system, and coincided with this event. In addition, as a Japanese government, the policy, for instance, those who went to Hokkaido for developing the land, and the Hawaii had a very flourished sugar plantation, and that was the agreement with Hawaii. So in 1885, the public supported immigration started for the Japanese people to go to Hawaii, and then started to increase the immigration to the United States as well. Since 1885 until 1920, more than 200,000 Japanese entered Hawaii, and mostly worked for the sugar plantation. And the third, at the time of the Japan-Russo War, Japan is the smallest country in the Far East, but barely won the war, and it was a shocking event for the Western countries, particularly across Pacific, the ocean in the United States. This impact was great. In addition, in the United States, there are increasing number of the immigrants from Japan in the United States, causing various problems. For instance, in the state of California, Washington, the state of Oregon, the movement of anti-Japanese activities culminated in 1924. The new Immigration Act of 1925 in the United States. This law was strongly anti-Japanese, to the extent that the law even purged the Japanese people from the United States. So with the revision of the immigration law in the United States, Japanese immigrants couldn't enter anymore in Hawaii or the United States as the simple work, farmers and other simple works. And in the middle of the 1920s, the Brazil was the only country which could accept the large number of Japanese people, particularly the coffee plantation in Brazil was in the midst of the development as a big industry, and collective the immigration started in Kasatoma immigration in 1908, and in 1924, 1925, the immigration started to be more than that, particularly supported by the national policies of Japanese government, which encouraged immigration to Brazil from the midst of 1920s and the beginning of 1930s. There was a peak of the immigration of the Japanese people in Brazil, but number 5 in 1934, again, even in Brazil, there was the new law which was restrictive to the immigration of Japanese and also anti-Japanese. In 1934, 1935, more than 20,000 Japanese immigrated in Brazil. But in 1934, this immigration law with the anti-Japanese nature was enacted, and there was a quota which was reduced to 2,500 per year. But looking at the situation in Asia, in 1935 there was 1941, the Manchuria incident occurred, and the Japanese the troops advanced, and the Manchuria was established as a result. And then Brazil, on the other hand, the new law of immigration, anti-Japanese law was enacted. So the wave of the Japanese immigrants shifted the direction to Manchuria in 1936. As you know, Japanese farmers, 1 million, and 5 million the farmers were expected to immigrate in Manchuria as part of the national policy of Japan. In 1941, the World War II erupted. Therefore, the immigration to the foreign countries were interrupted. And then the Pacific, the islands, and the Korea and Taiwan, and those areas of the influence, many people came back to Japan, and those soldiers that demobilized came back to Japan as well. And this was a repeated migration of the Japanese people. And with the peace treaty of San Francisco in 1952, at the end of that year, with Brazilian migration, the migration to overseas countries was restarted. There is no statistic numbers, therefore cannot give you any tangible number. But after the war, Japanese the people immigrated to South America and Brazil, and they were originally came from the immigrants in Brazil or those who went to Manchuria first. And this kind of immigration continued up until 1970s. So this is the quadruple structure. And let me review the history briefly. And then I'd like to move on to the history briefly of the Japanese children's education. The Japanese immigrants who went to Brazil, and in 1908, as I mentioned before, started with a Kasatomo immigration. I think many of you know this. The Japanese immigration to the Brazil was basically the farmers who worked at the coffee plantation, but part of the immigrants remained in São Paulo city and created and developed the urban community. In 1915, the oldest in Brazil, the oldest in São Paulo, the Taisho Elementary School was inaugurated. In 1913 and 1914 in Santos and Guatapara, there was a farmers' community, and there's a material which indicates there was a school in those areas as well. However, the Taisho Elementary School is a notable example, and therefore I want to talk about this representative elementary school of Taisho.
In the left, toward the end of 1910s, Taisho Elementary School, teachers and children around that time. And The man with the hat on the right-hand side is Mr. Shinzo Miyazaki, the only teacher of Taisha Elementary School. And Mr. Miyazaki founded this elementary school. And the children in the photo include the first lower house representative Tamura Yoshikie, the first Nikkei representative of the parliament, and also Toru Haga, the first Japanese lawyer in Brazil, and his elder sister, who became the leaders of Nikkei community after the war. And on the right-hand side, you see the photograph of Seishu Gijutsu, a Protestant church and an elementary school, and also a boarding house, all combined. The very first boarding school of Nikkei in Brazil, which opened in 1922. And Midori Kobayashi in the back is a Protestant minister who graduated from Doshisha School of Theology. He studied further in the United States and then came over to Brazil and dedicated his whole life to Nikkei education and Nisei education. In the early days, Seishu Gijuku Private School had important characteristics. As you can see in the photo, it had not just Nikkei children but also non-Nikkei Brazilian children. In 1924 and 1925, Brazilian migration became a kind of a national policy of the Japanese government, and there was an increasing population of Nikkei people in Brazil. And it means that there were an increasing number of Nikkei children that necessitated the opening of many more Nikkei schools in Brazil. This shows the change over time of the number of Japanese education institutions in Brazil. In 1915, when Taisha Elementary School opened, and toward 1925 and beyond, the number of those Nikkei schools increased. Most of them primary education school, including private school, and in the 1930s, the vocational school, a women's school, also opened. And toward the end of 1930s, according to some literature, over 600 Japanese schools were operating. A lot of Japanese schools were operating in the state of São Paulo and the state of Paraná. One characteristic of Nikkei in Brazil in comparison to Nikkei people in Hawaii and the mainland United States, the latter in early days were mainly a single unmarried men. But as regard the collective migration to Brazil from 1908, it was basically a migration of Japanese families, including school children in the family members. And so men and women and their children. And furthermore, after they arrived in Brazil, they had more children, and it increased the need for further educational institutions of Nikkei. So in the 1930s, there were many school-age children in Nikkei communities in Brazil. In this manner, in the 1930s, Japanese children education reached its peak. And in 1930s, in Brazilian history, nationalization policy was aggressively promoted. In 1930, Vargas got the power through coup d'etat, and till 1945 he remained in the president position, and in 1927 he executed the coup d'etat, and in 1937 he established a new state system. He stopped the operation of the parliament, and he led to the amendment of the constitution, like a Mussolini administration and Salazar administration of Portuguese, he pursued the dictatorship of state socialist characteristic. Under such circumstances, nationalization in Brazil was promoted aggressively and rapidly. And the target of their oppression was a foreign language school. In 1937, the teaching of foreign languages to those under 14 years old was banned as a law. In 1938, at the end of the year, foreign language schools were ordered to close down. In this way, toward the end of 1930s, German or Japanese language education, especially in primary school system, were banned. There is one assumption behind today's lecture. That is my question regarding the established view. In the previous history of immigration in Brazil, for instance, as you can see in the Encyclopedia of the Nikkei People in the American Continent, written by Professor Ninomiya, he showed a generally accepted view that by 1938, schools of Axis countries, Japan, Germany, and Italy were all closed in Brazil. Unquote. And that was the end of all descriptions about Nikkei education. And in 2008, the 100th year of Japanese migration to Brazil was celebrated, and there was an official history of Japanese migration to Brazil published. There was very little account of what happened after 1938 when the Japanese Nikkei education was more or less closed down. So it seems to give us an impression that everything about Nikkei education stopped after 1938. But restriction and banning of Japanese language education in Nikkei children was restricted, and there was a trend toward monolingual education to Portuguese education. But does it mean that everything about the Japanese education culture, especially the education and practice of ethics, only declined? I challenge this established view. For instance, we can look at the Japanese language newspapers published in Brazil around that time, and also in the beginning of the 21st century, when I was doing this kind of research in the 1920s, in the 1930s, there were a lot of Nikkei people still alive. I could interview, although many of them passed away, and I interviewed them as informants, and I have such data which show that there were some important Nikkei activities in the 1930s, such as martial arts, sports, and home front movements, and also the school excursion, which were not included in the Brazilian public education, were practiced as Japanese style education. So with what I mentioned as a assumption, I would like to speak about the characteristics of the Nikkei education in Brazil in 1930s, around that time. Especially in Nikkei primary education, we can see the duality of Japanese education and Brazilian public education. This is an excerpt from the publication by Nikkei Rikkokai in 1940. This is a collection of Nikkei children in primary school writings. So those are the writings written by Nisei of Brazil. I'd like to read out the underlined portion. This particular writing was written by a Paulista Line Tokyo Colony elementary school, the 5th grader, a boy. Quote, Today, our class learned about the celebration of the empire's 2600th anniversary. I felt very grateful that I am Japanese, although I was born in Brazil. Unquote. So this boy was born in Brazil. In Brazil, nationality is given to the person who was born in Brazil, and therefore, by that definition, he is a Brazilian. But he feels that he is a Japanese, which is a kind of ethnic identity he feels. And toward the end of this quote, he says as follows, the underlined portion. In our colony, we study Brazilian, that means Portuguese, from 8 o'clock to noon, and Japanese language in the afternoon, unquote. So he and his other students were studying in the same school building, but in the morning they all studied Portuguese, and the teacher was a Brazilian, and that was a kind of a Brazilian public education, but in the afternoon they learned Japanese language, so it was a kind of a duality or double schooling in the same school building. And then he also says, quote, I cannot read newspapers well yet, but every time I hear how strong Japanese soldiers are, I am determined to study as hard as they are and work for the country, unquote. As I said, he is a Brazilian by definition, and he was born in Brazil, but he says that he wants to work hard for the country, and from the context, this country means Japan. Next writing. Again, Brazil Republic Elementary School, 6th grader, Mr. Kitano, a boy, and this was located in inland Brazil. First, he says that Brazil is a nice country, a very big country. And let me draw your attention to the underlined part. He says, I study Brazilian as well as Japanese. That means I study Portuguese as well as Japanese. My Brazilian class is full of Japanese and Brazilian students and very lively, unquote. Again, they were studying in the same school building, and they learned both Brazilian and Japanese language. And he also says, quote, as we study both languages, Brazilian and Portuguese, we will study even harder and as hard as Japanese children and acquire the Yamato spirit or the Japanese spirit as Japanese. So acquisition of Japanese spirit or Yamato spirit was regarded as a target by this boy. So those writings were mainly written by children in the rural communities. And this photograph is toward the end of 1930s, taken in Taisho Elementary School in urban Brazil, São Paulo. And one of the slogans of Nikkei education around that time in Brazil is to foster good Brazilian citizens with Japanese spirit, as stated by Midori Kobayashi, the founder of Seishu Gijuku. Yamada Luisa, a Nisei teacher, is teaching the second or the third grader Nikkei children, one of the very rare photographs we have. And please look at this blackboard. This shows Historia. So this is a class of learning history. And on the third line, Quando or Brazil for Escabeto, a question given to the students when Brazil was discovered. From this photo, we can see that in the urban setting toward the end of 1930s in elementary school, Brazil history was taught by a Portuguese-speaking teacher to Nikkei children. So again, we see the duality of Japanese education and Brazilian public education running in parallel. This is the schedule given by Mr. Enes, a very important informant for me. He was born in 1924, and this is the time schedule of his school life in 1937 or around that time. In his case, in the morning, he went to a public school in São Paulo, that is Campos Sales School, And this school was situated across the street from Taisho Shogakko Elementary School. So it was just a matter of 2 to 3 minutes going back and forth. And in the morning, they learned Portuguese in Campos Salles Elementary School, and in the afternoon, he learned Japanese language in the Japanese education style. And he liked playing baseball very much. So in the afternoon, he played baseball every day. He was a very important informant for me. And when he began to speak about baseball, it was all he discussed. In 1937, in the boys' baseball tournament, he was able to got the 3 strikes in a row against various baseball teams. And he was, in a sense, a very interesting informant who kept talking and talking about baseball once it began. So in the 1930s, for Nikkei children, the education was at its peak, and especially in Japanese schools, Japanese school and Brazilian public education were both practiced as a dual education. Then, at the peak of Nikkei education in Brazil, what is the political background? So, I would like to look at the interconnection of 2 modernizations of Japan and Brazil as a context. As I mentioned, in the 1930s, Brazilian power was held by this man shown in this drawing. And you can see his photograph in the placard on the right. President Vargas, he is still regarded as the most biggest politician, who was a politician from the Rio Grande do Sul. And he promoted in the 1930s the new state policy and the nationalization policy, especially for school education. Brazil was the United States system, and for primary and the secondary education, the states had the power to decide what to do for primary and secondary education, but the power was delegated up to the central government under his presidency and administration in the name of new state and nationalization. If you look at how Nikkei people lived around that time in Nikkei communities, this is one example. This is a reproduction of a house in rural Nikkei community. And also you can see the imperial portrait of Emperor Showa and Empress Showa. I earlier mentioned the quadruple structure of a Japanese empire, and I used the term the imperial exclave. In Brazil, especially the rural communities had strong characteristics as the empire's exclave. For instance, on 4 grand national holidays such as Empire's Foundation Day and the Emperor's Day, the people in the communities got together, assembled in the rural school over a radius of 10 kilometers. The rural Nikkei community expanded, but often the case in such a rural community, school was the only place where all of those Nikkei people in rural community got together. There, they paid respect to the imperial portrait and read out the imperial script on education, and they raised the national flag and they sang in unison the national anthem of Japan. So it was like a miniature of what Japanese society was like back in Japan. So Nikkei communities had a characteristics of the imperial exclave around that time. But under nationalization policy, Japanese communities, needless to say, were severely criticized and attacked. And so, Nikkei communities in Brazil, as a Japanese imperial exclave, there are some documents that demonstrate such a characteristics. In the left, you can see a Brazilian Portuguese newspaper, Diário da Noite, which were published in urban areas of Brazil. Assim que começou de Manchuria. It means things happened in this way in Manchuria. And actually, the drawing was much bigger than what you can see in here. The illiteracy rate was very high in Brazil at the time, so there were many drawings used in Brazilian newspapers. There is a map in the center which shows the state of São Paulo. And there were many Nikkei communities. And all the small dots indicate the places of Nikkei communities. And it seems in the left, a Japanese soldier is aiming at them, and on the right, this is a dragon, seems to be a symbol of Japan at the time, as imagined by Brazilians. And also from the ocean, the naval vessel is aiming their cannons at the state of Manchuria, at São Paulo. So the Manchuria incident took place, showing the clear intent of Japan to invade into the continent. And Brazil had a very high sense of danger. And it seems to say that if they don't do anything, Japan may come and invade into Brazil. On the right, you can see the book cover written by a very famous Brazilian journalist in 2000, Fernando Moraes. The title of the book is Dirty Hearts, and that was made into a film and became a bestseller. This is a photograph of Nikkei, a young man taken after the war in 1946 January in the state of São Paulo, in a small town called Toppan. Japanese Nikkei people were celebrating their New Year's, raising the flag of rising sun, but they were cracked down by the local police. And the policeman wiped off the dirt on their shoes with the flag and tried to take it away from the community to the police station. And those 7 Nikkei youth got really angry and armed with a pistol and a nihonto sword, they raided the police station and they were arrested by the police, and their trousers and shoes were all confiscated. But as you can see from their faces, they show no regret. They even looked like they were winners and victors. And I may be overreading the photo, but that's the impression I got. In 1945 August, Japan got defeated, but there were some Nikkei people who didn't accept the defeat of Japan. Actually, 90% or more of Nikkei people didn't accept the defeat of Japan. And those people were called a victory group. And this is a photo of the young man of the victory group who denied the defeat of Japan in the war. They were given the Japanese style education during and before the war. I earlier read the writings by school children, and they learned ethics, such as acquisition of the Yamato Japanese spirit. It seems that those people, when they were young, really believed in such spirits, as we guess from such an incident.
You are looking at the contents of the law in 1938, which is the 16th chapter and Article 85 of the foreigners immigration law. This is anti-foreigners and anti-Japanese. For instance, there are two articles. For instance, the article number 1. The school should hire only the native Brazilians, and only the native Brazilian can teach. In other words, even they are Japanese or even they are the Germans, if they are not born in the Brazil, they cannot teach. And also in those schools, according to the second article, this is a Brazilian school, and there are Brazilian Brazilian people who are immigrants are from the Japan, and for those people under 14 years of age, the foreign the language cannot be taught. For instance, a foreign language such as Japanese and the German language cannot be taught. And mostly in those days, Japanese immigrants, the farmers. And finally, in 1938, in December, all of the foreign language schools were closed in the Brazil, and 294 schools in São Paulo and 476 in Brazil, the Japanese schools were closed. And there was an order to close all of these Japanese schools. Then this will be the negation of the education of the Japanese children, the children of the immigrants in Brazil. The school activity was about to diminish or not. Actually, there are many measures taken. For instance, under the law of the national flag, the Brazilian national flag should be raised according to the law. But you are looking at the picture taken in the 1930s. This is the graduation ceremony of the Taisho Elementary School. In addition to the Brazilian national flag, you see the flag of Japan. By juxtaposing these two national flags, they eliminated the potential problem of this violation of the law. In addition, during the peak of the Japanese the education, from 1937 to 1938, the first Japanese textbook was prepared. And the first chapter is entitled Hana or Flower, and the cherry flower is introduced. But in the back, also you see the ippe flower, representative of Brazil. The cherry blossom is the representative flower of Japan. On the other hand, the ippe is a Brazilian flower. So those two countries, Japan and Brazil, are simultaneously respected, the native country as well as the country of Brazil in which they live. And then you are looking at the number 5 section of the Japanese reader, which is entitled Jesus, the bugle soldier. In the midst of 19th century, there was Paraguay, the war, and this is about the hero of bugle, the soldier Jesus. When he started to the blow, he was hit by the bullet of the enemy, and momentarily the bugle left the mouth, but only momentarily, and he continued to say march and march, and starting and flourish of the bugle reached all of the soldiers in the troop, even though his arm was bleeding. You may have heard this story because it was introduced in the ethics history of the Kiguchi Kohei, and this is written to Jesus, the bugle soldier. And the Japanese hero was replaced by this Jesus, a Brazilian the hero, to teach the essence of the Japanese culture and the Yamato spirit for the posterities. And in this kind of a textbook, you can see this kind of a strategy of the Japanese cultural education to the next generation. But as a fact of the history, since 1938, under the new regime of the country, there was the oppression of the education of the foreign languages and the foreign schools. And this is a Brazilian newspaper in Japanese, and this is September 27th of 1938, and there was the arrest of the schools which violated the law in Rio Grande do Sul. Rio Grande do Sul is bordered with Argentina, the southernmost area of the Brazil, and the German school was closed. And there was the oppression of those schools, and in addition to Rio Grande so they were having the sense of a crisis. This may extend to São Paulo in Panama. This is south to São Paulo state, and many Japanese came to this area to develop the area. And according to the information from that area, there was a strong and a severe surveillance of the authority, and the traveling education was also difficult and almost impossible. Therefore, operations started from the south and extended to the northern area of Brazil. 1937 and 1938 and onwards, particularly in those days, there was oppression upon the Japanese schools and the Japanese education. And there are some characteristic features. For instance, the popularity of the martial arts and the home front activities and the movements, and graduation excursion, school excursion, which didn't exist in the Brazilian education. You may have some table in your hand. Let me show you. For instance, this is the activities since 1933 of the martial arts and the sports activities of the Brazilian Japanese young boys. And this is the 25th anniversary since 1908 of the first immigration, and the various commemorative festivals were held. And particularly in those days, the sports activities are very popular. In 1933 and 1934, particularly, the all Brazilian and the baseball or the athletic meets were held involving the entire Brazil. Once again, as you see from these pictures, particularly in addition to the track, the sports and the baseball were considered as the most popular sports, and in a case of the Japanese, the popularity of those sports. Also in Brazil, activities are very flourishing. For instance, in some cases, judo and kendo, the places were closed, but Japanese Educational Institute started to activate the sports. In 1938, started to change its own character of the sports activities. You are looking at the material This is also from the Brazilian Japanese newspaper, September 13 of 1938. Simply put, particularly those underlined parts will be stressed. September 7th, commemorating the independence of the Brazil, the sports athletic activities are held in São Paulo. And then secondly, the athletic activities is the life of the young people. Therefore, through the sports activities, because Brazil, the climate is always the mild and the less stimulus. Therefore, it's better to encourage young people through these sports activities and encouraging these sports and athletic meets among them. And the third paragraph, through the fair play of the athletic activities, the personality of the athletes will be developed and also develop the strong bodies and develop physically of these athletes. But the judo, kendo are the martial arts, traditional the sports of Japan, and this would be accompanied with the training of the mental aspects of the young people, and therefore it was considered as very effective for developing the personality of the young people. And this is also the Japanese the journal. The New Year's Day of 1939 of the Japan-Brazil the journal, looking back upon the 1 year of the sports activities of Japanese people, and various the activities are held, and the spirit was so strong, and the health at home front activities. Now, the young people, the sports activities should have the dignity and the ceremony, like in the case of the peacetime. The Japan-China the war broke out, and the home country is fighting the war. And secondly, recently, people are crying out nationalism. This is a nationalism. Nationalization policy has been promoted by the Brazilian government, and they felt that the Japanese people were oppressed, and therefore they sense the time is quite not a peacetime but a non-peacetime, and they were thinking that they were looked at the distance and coldly. Therefore, the sports without any national borders could be the opportunity to maintain the superiority of the Yamato ethnic people. And this is young boys. The baseball activity has a increasingly more important mission in the wartime. This is the 1st of January 1939, and praising all of the boys who worked very hard in the baseball games. And in addition, the school education has been limited so strongly and almost none. But in place of this education, if we could encourage the way of baseball, we don't have to be so pessimistic. By pursuing the baseball and through the spirit of the baseball, they considered possible to transmit the Yamato spirit to the posterities. Now the Japanese education is not possible, and the sports was the only way to transmit the Japanese people's spirit to the possibilities.
Again, this is an ad which was presented in the Nippon newspaper. This is an ad, a kind of propaganda from the Japanese sports goods stores. And it says, let's prepare for the home front defense by doing sports. So there was a big overlap between the sports activities and home front movement as a propaganda. Now about this home front movement activities. Again, in newspapers, Brazil Jiho, August 9th, 1937. In 1937, July, Sino-Japan War broke off, and in that regard, the following newspaper articles can be found. Please look at the first paragraph. It says, I was born in Brazil and don't know much about Japan. This is the third grader in elementary school. And so he was born in Brazil and Brazilian by nationality. I read the underlined parts. I learned from my school teacher and father about Japan and China. So he learned about the Sino-Japan War in school. And he says, it's thanks to His Majesty the Emperor of Japan that I can live like this in Brazil, unquote. And the next article is about a writing by an inland Japanese community elementary school advanced course, Ms. Saito. We learned about Japan-China incident today from our teacher, she says. And toward the end, the underlined portion reads, as the case with the other boy, she says, this is a part of the children's library fund we earned by picking cottons every year. Please send it to our home country to help the Japanese military, unquote. So those children were collecting and saving money and donating them to Japan through this newspaper company for assisting Japanese military. So such a patriotic writings were very often carried in Japanese language newspapers in Brazil once Japan-China War broke off. That was a case of a Nikkei community school in rural areas. What about in São Paulo, an urban setting? In Taisho Elementary School, again, there was a following article regarding the children of the school. And this writing or article was carried in the newspaper in 1938, August 7th, and this is about the girl students of Taisho Elementary School. They visited Japanese houses one by one to collect 1,000 stitches to make a soldier's good luck belt. So if you read the newspapers back in those days, children in school were collecting comfort bags to send them to soldiers in the battlefield, or they were participating in the fundraising activities to send donation to defend their home country. Again, this is a certificate of receipts of donation for national defense. And this is a certificate given to sisters in Londrina in the state of Paraná. And so this is a certificate given to these two donors, issued by the then Foreign Minister of Japan, Kogi Hirota. I interviewed the elder sister. She cherished such certificate very dearly. In the 1930s, in Nikkei education in Brazil, what is interesting is about the school excursions. School excursions were not practiced in Brazilian public education. And this is a series of school excursion articles carried in the newspapers. For instance, the first one, visit by the children of the town of Registro at the city of São Paulo. Registro is to the south of the state of São Paulo, and the children visited the city of São Paulo as part of the school excursion. It says the town, the children visited São Paulo as a school trip, and Santos in the summer vacation. Unquote. It was a kind of a replacement of visiting their home country, Japan, and as a replacement, they visited the head office of a Japanese newspaper company or other Japan-related institutions. And also, they visited Ipiranga Institute, where they can find a very big monument celebrating the independence of Brazil. And they visited the very famous Brazilian Research Institute in Butantan or Agua Blanca Expo. So in school excursions, they not only visited places related to Japan, but also monuments and places which are very Brazilian and important for Brazil. And one interesting characteristic of school excursion around that time is as follows. As shown at the bottom of this slide, they visited the city of Sao Paulo and also went to cheer for their baseball teams in a baseball championship. So many rural elementary school children made a school excursion to the city of Sao Paulo, where a lot of a baseball tournament or track and field competition were held to cheer for the fellow boys and girls. And children from the inland schools almost always visited the port of Santos. First, they saw the ocean they never see as they live in the inland. And this is a photograph of a school trip from a rural community. And this is a Montevideo Maru ship, 700 tons, made and built in Japan, and this was one of the immigrant ships. So by visiting such an immigrant ship from Japan, they re-experienced their father and mother experience of coming over to Brazil, and also they learned that Japan was a country which was able to make such excellent ships which were able to sail from Japan to distant countries such as Brazil. In a way, it was a part of the resources related to Japan they visited, which allowed them to regain the pride as an ethnic Japanese. Regarding school excursions, in 2015, I wrote a paper, and this is included in the bibliography at the end of this slide set. So I would like you to refer to those materials later for further details. Now, what about the schools in urban areas such as Taisho Elementary School? Often the case they visited Rio de Janeiro. In 1939 August, Taisho Elementary School made such a school trip. On the night, taking a train, they left Sao Paulo and arrived in Rio de Janeiro the next morning, and they visited the president's residence and a parliament and Copacabana beach. Very much Brazilian resources were the places they went to. So those school trips of Nikkei schools in Brazil include not just visiting Japanese resources, but also Brazilian national resources as places to visit. And in this particular year, on the way back, they got on board Argentina ship, which made the last emigration voyage after the war from Japan to Brazil. And this is a photograph taken by the side of a pool on board Argentina ship. And it is said that Kenzo Tange, a Japanese famous architect, designed this pool. So on such a luxury ship, they enjoyed the cruise and went back to Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro from Santos. So as a summary, martial art, sports, and the home front activities and the school excursion were part of Japanese school education culture in the 1930s, and Nikkei Nisei children participated in such activities. And as another resources of Japanese boys and girl education culture back in Japan, those schools in Brazil subscribed to such boy and girl magazines published in Japan. Those magazines were read repeatedly by many boys and girls in Brazil. And those were also part of the resources they learned about Japan. Now I'd like to summarize my talk for today. I began to talk today trying to suggest the possibilities and the problems regarding the studies of education history of Japanese Brazilian children. First is the introduction of global perspective. I earlier referred to quadruple structure empire. So by incorporating such a global structure and space, we might be able to look at the migration of Japanese and look at Japanese education history from a global perspective. I refer to the patriotic writings written by Nikkei Nisei, and such patriotic writings and home front activities were also practiced in other Nikkei schools in Taiwan, Korea, and whatnot. And also before Pacific War, at the time of Japan-China incident, or in Singapore, or in Mali, or in the Philippines, similar patriotic writings were written by Japanese children in those countries. So very loosely connected space where people who understand Japanese lived was formed, and from such a global, wider perspective, we might be able to review the Japanese education history. And also, in the books I wrote earlier, the studies were more or less done on the continuity and discontinuity before the war, during the war, and after the war. But I think that we need to study more about the Nikkei Japanese education over a longer time span from the pre-war, during the war, and post-war period, especially not just continuity but also discontinuity. Thirdly, I have studied Japanese migration to South America, mainly Brazil. And on vessels, school-age children were assembled and they were given education on board the migration ships. So Japanese children who were born in Japan arrived at Japanese communities such as Alliance and others, but it's not when they began to receive Japanese education. Rather, even on board the ships, they began to study about Japan. So there was such a continuity of education from on board the migration ship to when and after they arrived in Brazil. And the fourth point is comparative studies about education of children of immigrant descents with foreigners of other countries such as German, Italy, or Arab. I cannot read those languages, but I hope to see more comparative studies between Nikkei children education with the education given to children of other ethnic groups in Brazil. This, I think, will reveal more about the characteristics of Japanese education. So, researchers of German or Italian and or Arab immigrants' children education, I hope that we'll be able to see a more collaborative or comparative studies. Last but not least, on a more ambitious note, when Japanese try to live in this global world as a global citizen, tracing the footsteps of immigrants, including Nisei, will help us know how the Japanese entered into the multilingual and multicultural environment and socialized with others. It is said that we live in the world with COVID-19. When we observe Nikkei immigrants, before the war, almost all of them lived in rural communities. They pioneered the land and they expanded their farms. And in the process, plague or cholera or malaria, such tropical infectious diseases killed many Nikkei immigrants. So the history of Nikkei immigration in Brazil is in a sense a history of battle and fight with infectious diseases. By looking at and analyzing their history and how the schools acted, we might be able to find the way to live forward in this era with COVID-19. My talk has been rather sporadic and not well organized. I will be very happy to receive your questions and candid comments. With this, I'd like to conclude my talk for today. Thank you very much for your kind attention.